Whatever our bedtime was as kids, we could stay up an extra half-hour if we were reading. My parents didn't care as long as I was under the spell of a Stephen King or a Douglas Adams. Now I read in bed. I read at work. I read standing in line. It's like, hello, my name is Nathan and I am a reader. If you're Stephen King and you have a massive body of huge-selling well-respected work, you can pivot and do whatever you want. I don't have that body of work. I don't have that audience that's comfortable with me enough yet to follow my bliss with me. My first 6 books were horror, I think because when I was young I loved Stephen King, John Wyndham, Daphne Du Maurier, and it's natural to try and emulate the books you first loved. Stephen King once told me he liked my writing, and that was great. Stephen King. Now I'm not crazy about him, but he's a great writer. When I was growing up, if there was a young adult section of my town's library, I missed it. I wandered right from The Babysitter's Club over to Stephen King. His books were big and fat and they seemed important. I eventually worked my way through most of the shelf, but it is the one that stuck with me. I've been a fan of vampire fiction since way back. I loved Stephen King, Anne Rice, Peter Straub, Robert McCammon, Shirley Jackson, lots of great horror and paranormal fiction. The largest 2 books I've ever read more than once are Bleak House, by Charles Dickens, and The Stand, by Stephen King, about 1,200 pages each. I have several books I can read over and over. With fiction, it's The Stand by Stephen King, which is my favorite all time. I read that at least once a year, the version which has 100,000 extra words, which is like the director's cut and unabridged. I love the story. I love the social connotation to it. The first time I ever met Stephen King, he came up to me, and we went to shake hands, and he had, like, this fake rubber rat that he kind of, shook at me. And I said, no, this is a cliché, this can't be. Stephen King is trying to scare me with a fake rat? It was just really weird. How many writers in history have ever been as famous as Stephen King? He casts an awfully long shadow. Nora Roberts, Stephen King, Lee Child, and George R. R. Martin write wildly different books. Their writing, plotting and styles have little or nothing in common, but they all write books and characters that readers find appealing. I have a huge author crush on Stephen King, have never met him, would probably embarrass myself, but it would be worth it. There's a bunch of Stephen King books I love. Salem's Lot was always one of my favorites. Needful Things, Moving Away from King, and Silence of the Lambs is always a good choice. Stephen King consummately honors several traditions with his rare paperback original, Joylin. He addresses the novel of carny life and sideshows, where the midway serves as microcosm, such as in those famous books by Ray Bradbury, Charles Finney and William Lindsay Gresham. They were kind of like little Stephen King stories, but these go back many hundreds of years. I went through a big Kurt Vonnegut phase. But the writers who made me decide at a very early age that this is probably something I wanted to do were Stephen King and Douglas Adams, when I was probably, 10 years old. Get your butt in a chair and write. If it comes out weak or bad or clunky or ordinary, then accept that this happens to everyone. Everyone. Get it down, get it done, and fix it in the rewrite. Just like everyone from Stephen King to J.K. Rowling to Chuck Palahniuk does. The Stand was great, adapted by Stephen King from his massive book. I'm a huge Stephen King fan. Stephen King is one of my all-time heroes, so, of course, the pressure never lets up. Every second, you hope he'll like it. I remember getting a call from him after he read my script for Hearts in Atlantis. He liked it. Talk about relief. Stephen King's It is my favorite book of all time. I was that kid that would come to the library and be like, there's more Stephen King? Great. I'm a big Stephen King fan. Stephen King, by far, is the standard bearer. I think anyone who writes suspense fiction and says that King isn't an influence is either lying or being foolish. I read his book On Writing before I read pretty much any of his fiction. The horror genre is vast and full of brilliance. Stephen King, Shirley Jackson, Herman Melville, The Book of Esther. I'll happily join that list. Unless you are Stephen King, a book signing is attended by maybe 40 or 50 people. Stephen King writes a lot of things that are really charming and quirky, and that are more ironic than horror. When I was young, there was no such thing as YA. You simply went from reading children's novels to reading adult novels. So one year, I was reading Tove Jansson, and the next year, I was reading Stephen King. I actually love Stephen King's writing. I mean, at Castle Rock, we've made 7 movies out of Stephen King books. I am not like Stephen King, who writes one book, then writes another. I finish a book and go off and look for wrecks. Then, 6 months later, I might start another book. You know, after filming the movie the book was still just as big. I think it was actually bigger. I think Stephen King went back and wrote extra pages. He's fantastic. I think Judy Blume, Stephen King, and Dean Koontz are the 3 authors responsible for my being where I am today. I owe them a lot. I attribute the black tones in my films to Stephen King, Tim Burton, Joe Hill and Richard Matheson. However, most of my writing is influenced by mental health. I'm incredibly passionate about shedding light on the stigmas associated with mental illnesses. I have been reading Stephen King since Carrie and hope to read him for many years to come. Sure, bestseller. I'd love to knock Stephen King off the top of the list. I know I won't, but, after all, I spend my life inventing a different reality. I love The Stand. I read it when I was a kid. It was one of my favorite books when I was growing up. I love Stephen King. I think he's a remarkable writer. Of course Stephen King doesn't believe in teen novels. I've started to suspect he doesn't even believe in teenagers. I read a lot of science fiction, but I also mixed it up with a lot of other genres, crime, literary fiction, as well as non-fiction. Author-wise, I'm a fan of Stephen King, Lauren Beukes, Robert McCammon, Raymond Chandler, Greg Rucka, Ed Brubaker and Gail Simone, among many others. I grew up reading Stephen King, Peter Straub, Clive Barker, Robert McCammon, Isaac Asimov's non-fiction books, and Roald Dahl. I grew up poor in crappy situations, various crappy situations. What kept me sane was reading and music. I had so many different literary tastes growing up, be it fiction like Stephen King or Piers Anthony or non-fiction like reading Hunter S. Thompson essays or reading the Beats. I was a huge fan of the Beat movement. My mom didn't write, but she loved to read. She liked books that made you a little nervous. Stephen King, Dean Koontz and Peter Straub were the 3 wise men of our family bookshelf. I thought The Shining was just absolutely wonderful. Stephen King reaches all kinds of people. In the beginning he was just dismissed out of hand, which was terrible. A modern-day Dickens with a popular voice and a genius for storytelling in any genre, Stephen King has written many wonderful books. I sometimes think that the In campaign appears to be operating to a script written by George R.R. Martin and Stephen King. Brexit would mean a combination of A Feast for Crows and Misery. When all of us are forgotten, people will still be remembering Stephen King. It wasn't until I was in my teens that I started admiring writers as inspirations for my own work, and my earliest influences there were Stephen King, Marion Zimmer Bradley and Richard Adams. Carrie was a pretty big-budget movie at a real studio, with a director that had already done a bunch of things and had some notoriety, and Stephen King was the writer. I think many people would say that writers like Stephen King have hypergraphia. The thing with Stephen King is that everyone dies, and everyone comes back to life, so you never know with his mind where things go. It's the same with Steven Spielberg, too. The movie is actually from a book by Stephen King called The Body. When they were gonna put it to a motion picture, they found the story was a bit too strong for the title The Body, based on a young kid's movie. It would be too heavy. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.